Hey everybody, we're back for another week. Hope you've had a blessed week. And we are moving into the 14th chapter of the book of Proverbs. And so grab your Bibles and study along with me. This week we're looking at a lesson called Living Wisely. And we've talked about through the first, we'll say 8 or 10 chapters in Proverbs about the path between the difference between the path of foolishness and following God's wisdom. And we've seen so much of what Solomon told his son as he was trying to teach him to follow the path of godly wisdom. Well, we talked about all the different things that go along with that, but today we're actually talking about the results of it. What are the results of choosing the path of godly wisdom versus the results of choosing the path of foolishness? And so just learning about godly wisdom isn't enough. We got to apply it to our lives. So, anything we learn is only so much. It's only so good as if we apply it to what we're trying to do each day. So, as we've learned along the way, hopefully we're applying things that we've learned each week as we've been studying this book. And I hope you've been able to, through your work week, through your days, as you encounter different people, as you encounter different situations, maybe think back and remember something that we've studied along the way, and it's helped you to make a good decision. I know it had an impact on my life and my days as I try to go navigate through life and make different decisions. And I would think back to something we've studied, and it's starting to click more and more. And so as we study along, hopefully we're learning how to apply these things to our life. That's what we're looking at today. And there are two possible outcomes. Obviously, since we're talking about the path of godly wisdom versus the path of foolishness, obviously there's going to be two possible outcomes, and that's joy or grief. It's going to be contentment or sorrow. It's going to be blessing or destruction. Our lives can be more joyful, more peaceful, and more fulfilling if we just commit ourselves to following God and His wisdom. And if we don't, and we try to do things our way, then usually we end up in a mess, and our sinful nature will lead us into a troublesome situation. We're going to make bad decisions. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through today. So now, some of you are really, really good cooks, I'm sure. I'm not. And so if I ever try to cook something I haven't learned how to make already, I have to follow a recipe. And some of you are really, really good at following recipes, and from experience that if you're trying to make something and you haven't made it before, you have to follow the recipe, and you have to follow those instructions just so. You have to use the right ingredients, the certain amount of ingredients. You have to do things in a certain order. The temperature has to be just right, and maybe you have to use a certain pan or a certain bowl, and you have to use just the right amount of this kind of flavoring or this amount of sugar or flour or whatever it might be. But if you don't follow those directions exactly and follow the recipe exactly, it won't turn out right. You can't substitute flour for sugar just because that's what you want to do. The recipe has to be followed, or it just won't be what it's supposed to be. I like watching some of these ladies that can make homemade biscuits, and you say, well, how much so-and-so? And they'll just say, till it looks right. And I never could understand, but they know exactly how much to put in there because they've got so much experience doing that. So they've already mastered that. But for somebody new, we have to learn the recipe, and we have to follow that. But they would tell you, I can teach you how. You just have to watch me, and I'll show you. And they'll show you, use this much of this, and this much of this, and this much of this, and you can learn it. So even for them, there's a recipe. It's just in their head. They've memorized it, and they don't even need to look at the paper anymore. So anyway, Solomon has continued here to show the difference between a wicked lifestyle and upright behavior. In chapter 14, he brings into consideration this critical insight that God's people need to grasp, and that is that our words and our actions would reveal the difference between wickedness and righteousness. Upright people would understand the value of instruction and discipline, but wicked individuals would favor treachery and violence. So our words and our actions matter. They are the fruit of following godly wisdom or following the path of wickedness. Of course, wisdom leads to righteousness and discipline and integrity, and wickedness yields violence and arrogance and destruction. And we can see the theme there. We've studied along. All these things should be becoming more and more clear to us. So he uses in chapter 14 this poetic formation technique called a chiasmus. And I had to look this up a little bit, try to find out what this was, because I'd never heard of it before. But it's actually where in the passage the verses from the beginning and the end work together, and the central point of the whole passage is in the center. So as we bounce through the chapter 14 today, you're going to see me bounce through the verses, and we're going to meet up in the middle. We're going to start with verse 8, and then we're going to actually use verse near the end and make our way to the middle as we finish up the lesson. So he uses this formation called a chiasmus, and it's when writers would write the main idea or the point in the center of the passage. So he uses this as we start verse 8 in chapter 14 of the book of Proverbs. Let's start with that verse today. The sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. So he mentions right off a sensible person. A sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way. The value of applying God's wisdom has to do with prudency. So we know what prudent means. That means to be wise, to think through something. So prudence involves thinking through an opportunity or challenge carefully before drawing a conclusion and coming to a decision. A sensible person would think things through to make sure that it's a wise choice in God's view. We'd take time to seek the Lord's direction and look for his wisdom to make sure that we're making a decision that he would want us to make. When we put it to work in our quandaries, we'll demonstrate we're trying to discern the way that he wants us to take. So a sensible person would consider his way. It says, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. So we've got some harsh words there, stupidity and fools. And think about a foolish person. They often employ stupidity because they just don't think through things. A foolish person doesn't think through anything at all. They just jump right in and go for something without even considering the consequences. They don't even think what bad result can come from this bad choice. And they definitely don't seek God's guidance in it. Foolish people don't take the time to think through a situation that they're facing. Instead, they make their decision quickly, and they dive headlong into their choices. And before long, the stupidity of their actions become obvious. You know, sometimes without meaning to, we'll watch somebody do something, we'll say, well, that was kind of stupid. That's just a bad decision. Well, why did they do that? Because we can look at it and go, just a little bit of thought, and that could have been avoided. So we say to ourselves, that was a dumb decision. I'm glad I understand not to make that decision. But foolish people don't even think. They don't even try to look to God's counsel. God's wisdom urges us to take a long look before we do something. I'm going to read that verse again. 8. The sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. They're deceived by their own actions. So have you ever watched somebody rush into something and you can say to yourself, that is not going to end well? Maybe they're making a decision about a job or making a decision about a relationship with someone, and you already can see in your heart, I can tell that's just not going to work out the way that they think it's going to work out. I think a lot of times when I watch kids, even though, especially my kids, as they're growing up, I see times when they're about to make a mistake, and I want to help them and say, don't make that mistake. But at the same time, I understand if they don't make that small mistake, they won't learn it, because the experience of making the mistake is what helps them to understand for their own eyes how to avoid making that same mistake again. But I'll definitely not let them do something where they'll get hurt. But I can see the same thing there as the inexperience of something that they're about to go through plays into their decision making, and I'll tell them after they make that mistake. I say, if you'd have just thought through so and so, now you understand why that didn't work out, right? And yes, I get it. And then we move on. So now verse 15 speaks to what I just said. The inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. So foolish individuals tend to be inexperienced when it comes to handling life's challenges and opportunities well. They haven't learned yet about the necessity of nourishing a relationship with the Lord, in which love for Him moves them to respect Him and His wisdom. So inexperience in a Christian's life, especially when it comes to a relationship with God, can cause us to make some bad decisions. If we're not careful, we'll believe things that we shouldn't believe. We'll just be so gullible that we'll just say, "Oh yeah, it must be true," and just go for it. But someone who has experience in studying God's Word and talking to God, has a strong relationship with God, they're going to be able to watch for things. It says there again, the inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. A sensible person can see what's coming to them a little easier. So an inexperienced person may make foolish choices, as they believe anyone who sounds trustworthy. That is a real danger in our world today, because we have so many people who claim to know all the answers, and they're spitting off all these claims that they make, and gullible people just soak it right up and think that it's absolute truth, just because they sound like they know what they're talking about. So we have to be careful in what it is we listen to. But sooner or later, however, they come to see that what they embraced didn't turn out to be very wise after all. Inexperienced people will lack the ability to seek God's guidance before making a choice, and they have to learn things the hard way. Look at some verses here. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Look, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. In Romans 16:18, they deceive the hearts of the unsuspecting with smooth talk and flattering words. In 1 Corinthians 14:20, don't be childish in your thinking, but be infants in regard to evil and adult in your thinking. So these are some things that tell us about not being gullible. Try not to be caught off guard. So a sensible person, sensible Christians, take an altogether different approach. We'll walk with the Lord because we love Him, and we're certain that He alone can make us wise. And we seek His direction, and we take a path that He leads us to choose. We'll move ahead at His pace and in a direction that pleases Him, and we watch our steps. So sensible people seek God's wisdom. We love Him and we trust Him to lead us. We carefully plan and consider His will before we act. And sensible people will do that. So if we're following godly wisdom, we're going to take time to talk to God about things. We're going to pray to Him about things. We don't just jump into a big decision without talking to Him, without praying about things, without asking, what does Jesus really want me to do? What is it you want for my life, God? What is this fit in your will for me? And we talked a couple of weeks ago about God's will for our life, and there's no way for us to really know all of God's will for our life, especially people that pray for, what is God's will for my life 5 years from now? He may not tell us that, but we can say, well, God, what's your will for me in 10 minutes? Go do that. And then we move our way forward. But we'll take our time to talk to Him first and try to do things His way and listen to Him before we act. So we ought to do this in all areas of our lives. Think about how people's lives would be so much different if they just used this strategy. If they would, with every decision that we make, talk to God first. Any decision it is. Should we go here? Should we go there? What about this job? What about this relationship? Lord, is this vacation the right one for us? Whatever it is, if we just pray about something every time we have to make a choice, then we'll be given more peaceful choices, more contentment as we go through things. But we'll make wise decisions. We'll make prudent decisions, like we said at the beginning of our section. Okay, the next section is called contentment. We're talking about being content. And we're going backwards again and remember, we were going to bounce through the verses here, so we're going back to verse 9. So fools mock at making reparation, but there is goodwill among the upright. So this comparison between people who turn out to be fools and God's people who live out his wisdom continues with the law of restitution. We're talking about restitution. Restitution for sin. You remember back in the Old Testament, there was restitution for sin. For example, a man who cheated, stole, or lied had to make restitution to the individual who had been victimized by his sinful actions. In addition, he had to present a guilt or trespass offering to the priest. So God's people have been instructed to regard the matter of restitution as something holy. Well, it says here, fools mock at making restitution. So fools had this misguided notion about accountability. They don't think anyone will make them accountable for their sinful behavior, not even God. And they mock the law. They really ridicule it. And anyone who tried to abide by it, they thought that rejecting the law would bring them contentment. Does this not sound a lot like our world today? That people think that they should not be held accountable for anything that they do. They mock at making reparation. This misguided notion about accountability. That no one could do anything to them. Made fun of and criticized anyone who tried to abide by the law. Well, criminals today think the same thing. They think that they'll be happy in a position of rebellion of the law. So instead, they live a life of emptiness and destruction. They think that they're going to be happy because of this. But there's no happiness in that. Instead, it says here, God's people who grew in his wisdom would respond to sin in an entirely different way. They would strive to be upright. They took restitution seriously because God's wisdom had guided them to understand the necessity of a wholesome relationship with other people. And as a result, their relationships would be marked by goodwill, a willingness to make amends and to see reconciliation. And they would experience true contentment in their walk with him. God's people made things right with other people, and they lived content lives. You know, if a true Christian does not like to be in a strained relationship with someone else, without trying to make amends and try to come to a place where everyone's good again. We're all good. And, you know, if we're striving to live in a Christian way and we're trying to live in an upright way, we'll understand what restitution is. If we do something wrong to somebody that we want to make good for it, we want to help make things right again. If we've done something to somebody inadvertently or indirectly, we want to make sure they're okay. We want to make sure they're not upset with us. We want to try to make things back to a place where everyone is in a good place and all friends. And so that's the difference there between the fools and those who are upright. Okay, so we have verse 9. Now we jump to verse 14. The disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. So this Hebrew term for a disloyal one paints a picture of someone who takes steps in one direction and then decides to turn back. The English word backslider comes from this term. In fact, a backslider in heart has been used in different translations of this verse. It suggests the sad reality that some people begin as loyal followers of the Lord, but lose heart and retreat. They will be held accountable for their disloyalty. So it says the disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves. The day will come when they can expect to receive full payment for the conduct. What it says here, the other side of that, the good one, what his deeds deserve. Now this doesn't mean that people can be good by their own efforts. It definitely doesn't claim that we can be saved by our works. But instead that goodness comes from the Lord. That our works are a result of our salvation. And we're taught that in the book of James over and over, as he says, let your faith yield good works. Goodness comes from the Lord, and so our walk with God yields goodness. It leads to actions that others see as good. Other people that watch us, they will say, those are good things. That's a good person because of the things that they do. It's a blessing to us, and it's a blessing to others. We're both rewarded. And the person who is good, it says a good one, what his deeds deserve. And so that person will be rewarded with a peaceful, blessed, and content life. As we live our lives trying to follow God and trying to please Him and obey Him and be obedient to His word, it's going to yield good things. It's going to yield good words and good actions from our lives, and we're going to live it out in living out God's wisdom, and it's going to show this true reward of this contentment that comes to us because of it. We'll be able to lay our head down at night and be in full contentment and peace because we've strived to live for God, and we've done the things that we can do each day as we interact with other people. Okay, going backwards again to verse 10, and we're hitting a section here that talks about joy. So verse 10 says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. A person's heart stores a whole range of emotions that remain shrouded from the view of others. Intimate relationships grow because a person shares his or her heart with someone else. We know that. As we become close friends with somebody, or have become close enough to someone that we consider them to be our significant other, and then eventually a spouse, that relationship grows because we share our heart with that person. We can share our pain as well, so we can share as much of our heart as we can, but we'll never share everything. There's no way we can share it all. We can't actually internalize the true depth of bitterness that may be locked away in someone's heart. We can empathize, but only to a point. Beyond that point, a person plagued with bitterness suffers alone. So we can only share a certain amount of our heart with others, but a bitter heart is by itself. This says the heart knows its own bitterness. The heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. So we have this bitterness, and now we're talking about joy. So this is another example in this verse. And we have to establish the difference between joy versus happiness. Happiness is conditional, and it's based on our circumstances at that time. And so I can say, are you happy? Yeah, I'm happy. I just had a good supper, or I just had a nap, or I'm going on vacation, or whatever it is, or I don't have to work today, or I got a new whatever it is. Yes. How about joy? Do you have your joy? Well, that's different entirely, because joy defies circumstances. It abides consistently in our hearts, and it doesn't fade when conditions fade. Now, so I have joy in my heart because I'm a Christian and I love God. And an unsaved person cannot understand what true joy is because they don't know Christ. Outsiders watch joy from a distance. Let me read that verse again. Verse 10, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. So an outsider, an unsaved person would be an outsider here, does not understand what knowing Christ can bring in a form of joy. A Christian can deal with just about anything, having a bad day, whatever it is, because the joy in their heart of knowing Christ and knowing that they have an eternal reward waiting for them when all this bad is over, it makes that joy sustainable. It makes that joy so strong that nothing else can defeat it. So we say, our joy is strong. We enjoy His presence, and our joy comes from that relationship with the Lord. Verse 13, even in laughter a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. Read it again. Even in laughter a heart may be sad. That didn't make sense now, does it? Even in laughter a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. Well, we consider laughter to be evidence of happiness. When somebody laughs, you think, well, they're happy. They must be having a good time. But laughter can also be a cover that conceals a heart that's drowning in sorrow. Somebody that is really got a lot going on inside in the form of pain and sorrow, but laughter covers it up for them. It's a shield. People sometimes turn to laughter in an effort to numb the pain of being sad. For people who suffer with sadness, a smile may hide more than it reveals. Deep inside a person's heart lies the unvarnished truth about happiness. We never know what's going on inside another person's life. Never know what's going on in another person's heart. When I read this, I immediately thought about the comedian Robin Williams, and just about everybody knows who he is. Watched his movies, seen his shows, and him doing stand-up comedy and telling jokes, and he was just hilarious, and he was so funny. And all of his movies are funny and good and fun to watch. But that man was miserable. He dealt with depression and all kinds of problems in his heart and mind that apparently nobody really knew about, or not many people knew about. And then he eventually committed suicide. He had nowhere else to turn, and so he gave up. So we don't know what's going on in another person's heart. It says here, even in laughter, a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. So we're looking at joy. Joy may end in grief. A heart full of joy comes from an intimate relationship with God. Believers don't need to develop a ruse, a blanket that covers our sorrow. Instead, we count on the joy that comes in our walk with God to sustain us, even when our hearts ache. And that's the difference between someone who is choosing to follow God. That joy that comes from knowing Christ, from following God, from following this path of wisdom, it can hold you through just about anything. Those with a relationship with God can go through grief and heartache much easier because they rely on the strength that they can draw from Him. And almost all of us have been in a situation where we've been to a funeral with where the family, many of them did not know Christ. And there's such a difference when you go to that ceremony and if you go to a ceremony where basically everybody in the family had a relationship with God. And those of you that's been through this definitely know what I'm talking about, because the difference is mind-blowing. Those people who don't know Christ, they're in just terrible shape. They're just distraught, no hope. They don't know which way to turn. They're just mourning so desperately because they don't have that strength from God to draw on. And people that do have the relationship with God and have a life with Christ, even though it's a sad time, and even though they understand that it's a time of mourning and grief and goodbyes and sorrow, there's joy that's part of it, because they understand that God has blessed this person and that there's an eternal reward that was waiting for them. And they know that the sadness that they feel is temporary, because they have that joy to draw from. Even though there'll be tough times ahead and the days won't be easy as they say goodbye to that person, that sadness will get drowned out, so to speak, in many ways, because of the joy they have from knowing God. And so there it says joy may end in grief. All right, the last two verses that we're working at, we worked our way toward the center here, and these are the central point of this whole section we're studying, is verses 11 and 12. And we've talked about the difference between wisdom and foolish regarding prudence or being wise, contentment, and just finished up joy. And so wisdom and foolish can now be compared in terms of their outcomes. And we've kind of looked at that a little bit already, but the outcome from those things, that's what we're going to hit on in 11 and 12. So let's read 11 and 12, looking at these two questions. What happens to someone who chooses a foolish path? And what's the outcome of a person who chooses to take the path of God's wisdom? This wicked person has rejected the Lord and refused to seek His wisdom. And that's where we're going to start. So verse 11 says, the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. So we have a house and a tent. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. So if the wicked has a house here, This person has rejected the Lord. They refused to seek His wisdom. They've built a house on a foundation of personal thoughts, their personal preferences, their personal philosophies, their prejudices. They're built it on their own ideas. It lacks a foundation. They're relying on self. This is going to lead to destruction, and it's going to collapse because there's nothing based on God that makes it up. All right, so the outcome of waiting, anyone who decides to ignore God's wisdom is destruction. Now, compare that to the tent. It says the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. Well, a tent's usually not a place where you feel very secure, but in this case, you're more secure in the tent than you are in the house, because the tent is of someone who is upright. A tent is a secure place when it's the home of an upright person. Being upright means right with God and showing it in our relationship with others. Our trust in Him enables us to put His wisdom into practice as we face whatever our days bring to us. So we said the path of the wicked is a house built on personal ideas and lacks foundation. It relies on self. The tent is someone who is upright, and it's going to be stronger. It's going to be more secure because this person is relying on God. And that's all it takes to make something stronger. All right, kicking back to some verses that we've already studied. Let's look at how this relates to what we just talked about. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. You heard this before. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your path. Verse 7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. And then Proverbs 2, back up a chapter, verses 21 and 22. For the upright will dwell in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. So we can see the difference there as we choose to follow God versus choose to doing the things our way. Verse 12. There is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way to death. So each person chooses a path for his or her life. And we've talked about this several times in other studies. Every person has to make this choice to choose to follow God or not follow God. This week in our kids camp, we talked about different people in the Bible who had to make a choice to follow God or not follow God, and looked at some of those names of people who didn't follow God, and those names of people who did follow God, and looked at the differences in how things turned out for those people. So each person has to choose that path for his or her life, and some people will depend on their own ingenuity to guide them as they choose the way that seems right to them. When they set out on a path without being wise in the Lord, they'll make the wrong choice. It'll seem right to them, but it'll be the wrong decision. They live in the hope that the path they've chosen will bring them fulfillment. Read verse 12 again. There is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way straight to death. This seems right because it's based on man's thought. It leads to failure and sorrow. And we should seek to take the path based on godly wisdom. We'll have fulfillment, we'll have peace, we'll have joy, we'll have a relationship with God that we can lean on to make wise decisions all the time. You know, as we studied this lesson this week, I can't help but think about the people in our world that do this very thing every day, and they say, I don't need God, forget it. I can do things just fine by myself, and we've got an entire society that is built on that one thought. We don't need God. We can handle it ourselves, and we're going to see as people choose that path, the destruction in their lives. And you know, I know that you can see the same thing I do as we watch people that reject God every day and watch their lives just become a mess, and then they wonder why. And we pray for them and pray that they'll see the path. And we said we're trying to live our own lives, trying to follow God, and hopefully it sets an example for them as we do so. But in finishing up our lesson, the whole time I was studying this, one of our nights at our kids' camp this week dealt with Noah and him building the ark. And I got to thinking about, especially when we were studying that little section about the recipes, how Noah had to choose to follow God in a situation where he was going to be completely by himself. He was told by God, there's going to be a flood. I'm going to destroy the earth, and you're going to be the only one that I save, you and your family. And he said, I need you to build above it that's 1.5 times the size of a football field, and gave him the exact dimensions and told him what kind of wood to use and how many levels it had to be and how much distance had to be between the top wall and the roof, and how many days and nights it was going to rain, and how many animals to get. So specific. And Noah said, okay. And he didn't hesitate to do what God asked. And he chose to follow God and listen to God. He loved God. He had a relationship with God. And he made the right choice. And think about, what if Noah said no? What if Noah said, I'm sorry, this is nuts. I'm not building a boat that big. I can't do it. What if he said, I don't have enough help? What if he just, all kinds of things that he could have done. And then on top of that, he was being made fun of the entire time he was doing it. Best I can study, it took him at least 55 years to build the ark. So for 55 years, friends and neighbors around him probably thought he was crazy. Probably thought he was mentally insane. And the whole time he was building the ark, I wonder if he said to his family, we're going to just do what God says. One day they're going to see. And it's going to be too late because they're just not listening. And I'm sure he was trying to tell them over and over and over, as we read this, he was warning people, there is a flood coming. You better get ready. And people rejected that whole thing. But Noah had to follow God's instructions so specifically, and he did so. And we're told here in Proverbs the things that identify a path of wisdom versus a path of foolishness. And we can choose to follow them or reject them. And it's not up to us to look at it and go, that verse I don't care. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to follow that one. But that's not the way we're supposed to be. I believe that when God says in His Word so and so, that's what it means. And we're not allowed to just sit and say, well, that doesn't fit today's times. Too bad. We'll just tear that page out and we're not going to study that anymore because that doesn't fit today's society. And so it says there's a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way straight to death. And if man starts thinking he's smarter than God, he's going to go down the wrong path. So as we study today, living wisely, following God's wisdom leads to joy, while failing to do so leads to grief. And that's the two choices we have to make here as we try to live wisely, to follow God's instruction, follow godly wisdom, and stay on that path that leads to joy. And so I hope we've learned a lot as we study today. I always learn so much when I study these lessons. Hope you do too. And let's have a prayer. Father, I just thank you for this day that you've given to us, and we just thank you so much for the blessings that you pour out on us. We thank you so much for this book of Proverbs that teaches us so much about following you and how to stay on a path that's full of godly wisdom. We know we're sinners and we're going to mess up and we're going to fail you, and we understand that that's just part of our sinful nature, but we also understand that if we just continue to try to learn and try to learn from our mistakes, from our experiences, and try to always avoid doing those things over and over, and try to look at the things that we're about to do and make godly decisions. Help us to lean on you, to look at the things that you have in your word, and help us to find that place of contentment and joy, and just be with us as we go through life, and help us to set examples for others that are around us. Be with everyone in their services this weekend. Help us all to strive to have a good time as we worship you. And we just thank you for everything that you do for us, and forgive us of our sins. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.